My name is Jen McLean. I'm the Executive Director of the International Game Developers Association, the IGDA, and we're the largest professional association for game developers in the world. We have about 10,000 members around the world. We have chapters in over 120 cities on 6 continents. Apparently there is not much game development happening in Antarctica, who would have guessed? And we have over 30 special interest groups as well. I've been a gamer since I was 7, and I got an Atari 2600 and fell in love with Pitfall. One of the proudest moments of my childhood was taking a picture of my high score and mailing the actual physical picture off to Activision, and if it was above 10,000 points, you'd get this package in the mail with a certificate and a patch. And I was so proud of myself. When I grew up, game developers to me were like rock stars. They weren't ordinary people. They weren't people that you'd ever meet. So when I was in college, my fencing coach was a game designer at a company called Microprose and got a friend of mine a job as a playtester. Fast forward another year or so, that friend asked me if I wanted a summer job as a playtester. And of course I said yes. That was perhaps the easiest question anyone has ever asked me. And 26 years later, here I am, still in game development. And I am here in game development 26 years later because I care passionately about the people who make games. I was having a good discussion with a friend of mine about a management philosophy called radical candor. And the idea behind radical candor is that you can only drive meaningful change if you care personally and you challenge directly. And I'm here giving this talk because I think the game development community has a serious need for some radical candor. We are facing extraordinary obstacles. I care so much about this community, and I'm also willing to offer some opinions and challenge it directly. And I hope that in this talk today, you take away the need for profound change and how you can help impact the global game development community. We like to say at the IGDA that it has never been easier to become a game developer. And at the same time, it has never been harder to succeed as a game developer. And this reminds me very much of the opening of A Tale of Two Cities, probably one of the best known lines in literature. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. And to me, this encapsulates game development in such a powerful way. Because look, right now we are in one of the most beautiful cities in the world, being hosted at an incredible event by Wargaming, being wined and dined, listening to professionals who are at the very top of their fields. When you think about the actual craft of making games, this is just a small selection of a number of the tools that are out there. It's a far cry from the assembly that was used when I started out in game development. And when you think about the opportunities our up-and-coming talent have, there are over 200 college and university programs around the world just in game design. That's not game development in general. That's not including computer science. That's not including marketing or business. Just game design. 200 programs. I am so sad that when I went to school, we didn't have these opportunities. When you think about the opportunity, the financial opportunity, the revenue, the money, it's clear to see that the games industry is delivering on nearly double-digit annual growth rate. And that's a growth that most industries these days would be very, very happy to have. And we're seeing ways that games can impact the world, helping to fight depression, being able to boost academic performance, helping people connect to each other and form real and meaningful relationships with each other, not just in a game, but outside of it. Whether it's a clan in World of Tanks, or it's meeting an 80-year-old lady in Words with Friends that you otherwise would never have come across. This is really special. This is really valuable. At the same time, we are being recognized as a meaningful art form. This is a picture of an exhibit in the United States National Art Museum on the art of video games. We've even had a movie made by Steven Spielberg about playing games. And games are starting to be recognized as something that anyone can play. We have silver snipers. We have 70 and 80-year-old competitive teams in Counter-Strike. This is amazing. This is fantastic. This is the best time to be a game developer. Except it's not. Because when you think about what else is happening, the truth is that there are more games being released than there ever have been before at any point in history. And this is true not just on Steam, but on every single platform we develop for. In addition, the games that are being made are significantly more expensive. So you start to see, this is a graph of the cost in millions of 2017 dollars, so adjusted for inflation, on a log scale of the cost of making games. And you can see kind of the explosion of indies in the 2010 to 2015. But what you also see is consistently the cost to make a game going up. At the same time, the cost that we spend to buy the new Assassin's Creed Odyssey is the same cost that we spent for Assassin's Creed Origin, same cost that we spent for Assassin's Creed Syndicate. We're not getting more money from our players. And some of the mechanisms that we use, things like loot boxes, free to play, they're coming on under more and more scrutiny and regulation. So we have a business where we have significantly increasing costs, but our revenue is pretty flat. When you talk to the actual people who are making games, the game developers themselves, they're going to tell you an even scarier story. More than half of the game development community has witnessed inequality in their workplace. That means that more than half of the people here perceive their workplace as having some kind of inequality. Permanent employees in game development had an average of 2.5 employers in the last 5 years. How many of you manage people? Anybody? So roughly about how long does it take, do you think, for somebody to get good at their job and to reach 100% productivity? Go ahead and yell out the answer. Over 6 months. So what this graph is saying is that just when you have an employee who is starting to peak, they are gone. That's really scary. And the Society for Human Resource Management estimates that to hire to replace an experienced employee who has left, it costs between 6 and 12 months of their salary. This is a financial crisis waiting to happen. Let's also talk about those 200 degree programs in game design alone. Let's say each one of those programs graduates 50 people. So if you do the math, that means there are 10,000 new graduates in game design alone every year. There is that crowd of people wanting a job as a game designer every single year. This has huge implications, first for the individuals who go through those programs and can't find a job in their chosen profession, especially if they are not fortunate enough to live in a place like the EU that has reasonably priced education. If you are in the United States, you may be incurring over $100,000 or more in debt to go to that game design program. And you also have people who are so desperate for an opportunity in their chosen field that they are willing to work in a situation that is not healthy, that is not compensating them fairly, and that is not treating them properly. Along those lines, we have to acknowledge that our player community can be toxic and can, in fact, even directly threaten us. When somebody says, if you're a game developer and haven't received death threats, how can you call yourself a game developer? We have reached the point of maximum fucked upness. There is no way that receiving a death threat should be considered a rite of passage. This is fundamentally wrong. Even worse, when something happens, our employers don't always stand up for us. When you, as a game development company, create the perception that your community controls your employment practices, what you're doing is rewarding bad behavior. For those of you who aren't familiar with the story, there were 2 ArenaNet employees who engaged with members of the fan community on social media, and they were fired because the fan community took exception to their language and thought that they should be fired. We can't really tell, I don't work at ArenaNet, I don't know if anybody does. I don't know the exact reasons they lost their job, but I can tell you that the fan community believes it was because they complained, which means that every time a game developer says something that a fan takes issue with, they know that by complaining, by actively trying to get a developer to lose their job, there's a chance that they will succeed. In doing what they did, ArenaNet created a reward for exactly the wrong behavior, for the behavior in the fan community that drives game developers away. And when you think about all of this, at the end of the day, what it adds up to is an industry that is not sustainable, to an industry that does not value its talent, and to an industry that is facing a crisis unless we as the global game development community do something together. And let me be clear, this is not an issue that impacts one company. This is not an issue that impacts one specialty, one type of game developer. This is not an issue that impacts one country or one geographic region. This is an issue, the glut of game developers, the economics that just fundamentally don't work, the glut of product, the way that toxic fans interact with us. These are issues that impact every single one of us. And just like those castaways on Lost, it's very true that we live together or we die alone. So now that we've got all the depressing stuff out of the way, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are actually elements of hope. Because now you have people who are coming together across all of the things that divide us. I think this conference is a great example. 35 countries are represented in the speakers alone. That is fantastic. And I give Wargaming, frankly, a lot of credit for not only recognizing the value in developers that are distributed around the world, but the value in highlighting the ideas that we all have, regardless of where we live, regardless of what our profession is, regardless of the specific roles that we play. At the same time, when we think about some of the talks that we'll hear today, for example, the lessons that developers have learned from moving from mobile to VR, guess what? Those are lessons that developers before you probably learned when they moved from console and AAA to mobile. There's so much opportunity for us to instead say, no, I'm not like you because X, Y, and Z, to say, you know, we share similar problems. We share similar experiences. We absolutely share similar goals. Let me help you along the way. We have community organizations that have made a real and meaningful impact. So just in the last panel, there was the founder of IGDA Estonia who talked about how game development has evolved in her country. When she started IGDA Estonia, Estonia has a great entrepreneurial culture, but there were no game startups. A ton of tech startups, no game startups. And now they see game startups that are equivalent to their larger tech industry. And they see that because having a community, having a tangible physical community, allowed people to say, wow, there are other people who are as passionate as I am. There are other people who want to do this too. Maybe I'm not crazy. Maybe I can really do this. IGDA Finland, very, very similar. Chris was talking about it starting as a group of 5 people. Now, for most of their events, they get 450 in Helsinki alone. And that's because the community together said, we value each other. We value that human connection, and it doesn't matter what company we work for. It doesn't matter if we work for Rovio or Supercell. It doesn't matter if we're making console games or mobile games. What matters is that we are a global community together, and we will share and we will support. This is a really tangible example of how that works. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Melbourne game community, Melbourne was devastated in 2008 by the global financial crisis. They had a number of major studios from EA, Take-Two, that closed within the space of a year. And in other locations around the world, that ends up sounding the death knell of game development in that city. But what is interesting about Melbourne is they actually banded together as a community. They worked with their local government, with Creative Victoria. They supported each other, and now they host one of the best events in the world with Melbourne Games Week, which is happening later this month. Now they have an incredibly aggressive funding program for game development. Now you are starting to see a resurgence in the Melbourne game scene, to the point where I was talking with a friend from Melbourne, and he said, yeah, there's actually a war for talent now. That's amazing. And that is a testimony to the power of all of us working together to overcome the obstacles that we face. I think it's also important to understand the opportunities. This is not a zero-sum game. So if you look, for example, at what game development can be, it's easy to say, I work for a very successful company like Wargaming. This doesn't matter to me. What do I care if indies are struggling to find funding? My paycheck is pretty secure. But the truth is that indie might be your hire a year from now. The truth is that indie might be the company that you want to acquire 5 years from now. They may invent the next great genre. And by helping each other out, not only lifting each other up, but eventually removing the systemic barriers that challenge us as an industry, we end up becoming more powerful together. One of the most important ways we make that happen is by sharing our failures. Because let's be honest, we learn a lot more from failures than we do from success. How many people here have heard of Cuphead? Yeah. So, relatively well-known indie game in the West. Those developers mortgaged their house to finish their game. That is insane. And you hear about it because they succeeded. What you don't often hear about are the developers who mortgaged their house and failed. And I give the creator of Where the Water Tastes Like Wine a lot of credit, because he was very honest in talking about his failure as a company and as a developer. And saying, he has more Twitter followers than he had sales of the game. This is a game that was featured at GDC, was featured in the Independent Game Festival, was featured at PAX. It had amazing press. And he was brave enough to share all of the bad decisions he made along the way so that other people could learn from them. That's something that takes incredible bravery. It is something that we as a community do not do enough. And it is something that we have to do, that I believe we have a moral imperative to do, to spare others the pain and suffering and the very difficult lessons that we have incurred. When we think about player behavior as well, one of the things we need to ask ourselves is whether it really is all about the player. Because if a player acts in a way that makes the game a bad experience for the majority of their other players, is that okay? There's a company called Ninja Metrics that used to do a lot of work with MMOs, and one of the things that they found was that there are players that actually have a net negative value, that they make the experience so bad for other people that their value to you as a game is negative. When you think about players who actively try to harass your devs, who threaten them, who try to get them fired, I would argue that we need to be even more aggressive in sending a very clear message to players that there is behavior we will not tolerate. And that, you know what, in some cases, the player is not the most important thing. Because if we allow our players to become more important than our creators, the message that we are very clearly sending to our people, to our team, to the amazing, wonderful brains and hearts and souls that form this industry, that form our community and create the games that we love, is that they don't matter. And if I'm using radical candor, I think we matter. I think we matter more than any player. I think we matter more than any single game. And I think we have to recognize that we are stronger together. We make more as the sum of our parts than any individual. And so when we allow someone to incur $100,000 in debt, knowing that the odds that they will get a job is slim, without telling them that, we fail. When we allow somebody to be fired without taking a stand about it because the community complained about them, we fail. When we allow people to think that making a game is worth sacrificing physical and mental and emotional and financial health, we fail. Because at the end of the day, we lose that talent. We lose those people. And that is something that is a bigger crisis than anything else we have faced to date. There's a huge opportunity. I believe that together we are stronger. We have at the IGDA over 150 chapters and special interest groups. We are one, while we are the largest, we are one of many professional game development associations. And when we work together, when we speak with a voice, when we partner, when we share the hard lessons and talk honestly about our failures, when we lift each other up, we succeed. We have an opportunity to work together for the good of everybody. We earn that victory screen. And that's something that I think we have an obligation to hold on to. We have an obligation to each other. And we have an obligation also, frankly, to companies like Wargaming who host this event because they see the value in not just developing their own employees, but in developing the community. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited to be here today. I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you very much. Anybody having questions? It's a really important topic.
Thanks for that, by the way. That was really great. And the question that I had is, what do you believe we can do when we're setting up new businesses or new studios that can help alleviate some of these problems and promote more positive cultural markers moving forward?
I think that's a great question, and there are a few things that I think are really important. First and foremost is understanding that you are building a company that you should want to work for, not just current you, but past you and future you as well. One of the things that we often think about is, oh, right now, I'm okay with spending 40, 50, 60 hours a week because maybe I don't have kids or maybe I don't have a partner. Right now, I'm okay with sacrificing my physical and my financial health to build my dream product. Is that going to be the case in 10 years? Would you find tenable the things that you are asking your team to do in 10 years? Would you have found them tenable 10 years ago? If not, don't do them. Build a team and a culture and a studio that will be welcoming and inclusive, not just of current you, but of future you and past you, and of all of the people in the game development community that you want to reach. And that, that also gets to how you treat people who are underrepresented populations. It gets to a lot of the policies that you put into place. Do you allow work from home? Do you allow, how much vacation time do you give? How much sick time do you give? And we often work in places where those things are mandated by law, but there's so much more than what is required. Because we've all been in situations where there's the letter of the law, and then there's the spirit, there's the culture that you are building. Thinking about the values that are important to you, the values that are important to your team, and also the values that are important to your player, I think is one of the most important things you can do. And then as you do that, create that reward structure that rewards adhering to those values. And if that is something like saying, we are a no-crunch studio, so we value accurate planning, we value contingency, we value people going home by a certain time, we value mutual respect and trust. Think long and hard about how you build in reward structures that actually highlight that. And that could be everything from your bonus, your compensation plan, to just telling somebody they did a good job. And those are all super important.
Hello, can I just confirm that you said 10,000 per year for graduating in game design?
I don't have hard numbers on that, and what I did is I assumed 200 programs, and game design alone, I keep stressing that, but it kind of blows my mind, to be honest.
Yeah.
If you assume that each of those programs graduates 50, and some will only graduate 10, but some will graduate 100, 50 times 200 is 10,000.
Do you then think that education providers for games specifically have a responsibility to be very transparent about the likelihood of employment after university?
Yes, I do, and the truth is that not all of them are. So some of those game educational institutions and some of the larger educational institutions do actually share those statistics. And if anybody is ever looking at going back to school or has a child or a friend, always make sure they ask for not only their job placement rate within a year of graduation, but also how many of those jobs are actually in the field that they studied, because those are really important metrics, and a lot of even reputable game colleges don't track that second. But also, dig into what are you doing specifically to help me? Do you offer portfolio reviews? Do you give me hands-on experience? Tell me about some of the places your alumni are working. Call the alumni up, because the truth is that these kids are getting ready to invest 4 or more years of their life that they will never get back. And their interests are not aligned with college and universities. At the end of the day, the college and university wants your tuition money. And ideally, they want your donations after you graduate, because that helps with their endowment. But if you end up working for electronic arts or being a teacher, both noble professions, they don't care. You might.
From the employee side, do you see sort of maybe a need or even room for things like unions or other collective bargaining and employee support organisations?
So unions are really complicated, and I don't think we can discuss unions without acknowledging that there actually are a lot of game developers who are members of unions, and there are a lot of game developers who live in countries where they can never join a union. So I lead a global organization, and that means that I understand that a lot of my members in countries like Finland and Sweden belong to unions, because that is part of essentially the social fabric of their society. I have members in China and Vietnam who, in China, they're not going to join a union ever. And as we think about unions, one of the things we do have to think about is, given that we are a global community, what does that mean? And what can we realistically expect unions to do and not do? And it's a complicated issue that I think is an important issue for us to discuss, but also it is important to recognize that just like they say all politics are local, at the heart of it, all game development is global.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I have a little bit of a what-if question, I guess. So the thing is that you showed us the statistics about the new graduates in game design, but also you can expect in IT management and so on and so forth. So that's hundreds of thousands of people a year. We have an absurd growth right now as an industry, and something that other entertainment industries would kill for. But this won't going to last. Even if we, as communities, change and do everything perfectly, that growth is not sustainable. So the question is, do you think we're pumping a gigantic bubble? Or are we maybe, in a situation where we can still grow like that for a couple of years and then slow down and not implode like certain industries before?
I mean, game development is cyclical, and I've seen that over 26 years, and I know we have veterans here who've been making games even longer. We will see a downturn in game development, and we will see an upturn again. And if you look, for example, at the impact of mobile as a platform back in 2008, 2009, that is part of the reason that we're seeing this amazing growth, that continued growth. Esports is another really big part of that. VR, AR, there was a ton of investment, and then a very quick contraction. So you saw that cycle in a very, constrained and limited way. I think we have to be prepared as a community that there will be a contraction, because it is pretty much a certainty. And part of it comes back to the economics, to the slides I showed before that show that increasing cost to develop games. If you were to overlay the revenue per player on it, it stays pretty flat, especially for AAA. That should make everybody panic. Maybe not panic, but certainly concerned, because it's obvious that you cannot sustain that. You cannot continue to incur costs unless you are also incurring more revenue. One of the other things that is a challenge is that we've tried to be, as an industry, really creative in driving that additional revenue. And some of the tactics that we've used may not be right for the player. They may not always be honest, and so you're seeing governments start to crack down on that. And Belgium certainly has been leading the way in that. So what does that mean? Does that mean that your average revenue per player decreases by 10 or 15%? If so, where does that money come from? Does that mean your development staff decreases by 10 or 15% as well? And these are all questions that as leaders we need to ask ourselves, and that we should also be asking our company leaders. So everybody, no matter what position you hold in game development, should understand the cash flow of your company. You should be asking, like, hey, how much do we make per player? And what does it cost us to acquire that player? And what does it cost us to develop a game for that player? Those are really basic metrics that we should all feel okay asking about, and that your company should feel okay sharing with you confidentially. And if you know that it costs us $5 per player for the product and another $2 to acquire them, and we're only making $7.10, that's a really big warning flag. If you're making $10, $15, great, awesome, then that's when you can start asking, okay, how are we using that money? How are we investing in growth? But when you look at the industry as a whole, those numbers are shrinking, and that's scary. And we should all be asking ourselves what that means for us as game developers. Especially when you combine that with your 10,000 plus graduates coming in, because that's a recipe for disaster.
Hi, Jen. Thank you for the talk. It was great. So my question is basically regarding the Telltale closure recently, right? So they did things, I guess, kind of the old school way of lots of crunch, but then you end up with a pretty good product. It's a lot of pain and a lot of gain type of thing. But financially, the gain wasn't there, right? And so, those people lost their jobs, and it was definitely not worth it in terms of, they created something great, like the games are critically acclaimed. But when you have a situation like that, and then you have situations where you can implement much easier revenue streams from microtransactions and the stuff that loot boxes and stuff that people are critical of, it's what is the incentive for any publisher, any developer to try and go that extra mile, to create a game that is critically acclaimed? And what if God of War or Spider-Man doesn't really sell that great, but then the next freemium title that the studio makes does. Like, is that I see that as unsustainable. Like, can you speak to that?
Yeah, so part of the problem with Telltale that we are not talking about enough, and part of the reason why is because it is still very fresh, especially for those of us in the US who have friends who are impacted, is that fundamentally Telltale could not succeed with their business model. Because the reason they asked their team to routinely, not crunch, but routinely work 60, 70-hour weeks is that they could not make enough revenue for their titles to support the real cost of development. They could not make enough money from their business model to actually pay their developers what it cost to make the game. And that's something that is a huge, huge problem. There's a lot of different reasons people crunch. If you're being asked to crunch because the math doesn't work, that's probably the worst possible reason, because that's not something you can fix with the next sprint. And that's why I think it is really important that all of us start to ask those questions. Like, hey, if we know, if we look at our audience for The Walking Dead, for example, and we know that our average player revenue is $5, but it costs us $4.50 to make the game per player, plus another $1 to acquire a player, that math doesn't work. If we know that, okay, maybe it's $5 revenue and it costs us $1 to acquire the player and only $3.50 to make the game, but that making the game means that you're not paying people for half of the hours that they work, the math doesn't work there. And at the end of the day, you actually end up not only having the human cost of knowing that you're exploiting your team, but also the cost of losing the people you need to keep the most, because that has a real intangible cost as well. And that's why I feel like I have mentioned economics way too much in this talk, but I really want everybody to understand that, because that should be your canary in the coal mine. That should be your warning flag. As you see the cost to develop titles go up, and the cost per player to stay, or the revenue per player to stay constant, you have two options, right? Well, you have three. You can increase your revenue per player. That's hard because we're seeing more and more scrutiny on that. You can increase your player base. There's a huge opportunity there. And one of the things that I think we as a game development community should be doing is looking at the people who are underserved by the games that are out there today. Or you can cut your costs. There are lots of ways to cut costs. You can cut the size of the game. You can go from a 60-hour player, single player experience to a 40-hour single player experience. You can make games with a more experienced team, have higher salaries, but you often compensate by doing better work. You can make games in different parts of the world that don't have the high salaries that you might see in some place like San Francisco or New York. But you have to do something. And the worst possible option is to just ignore it and assume that because we made God of War and sold 4 million units at a price point of $60 million, the next God of War we make will also sell 4 million units. And we don't have to worry that, guess what, our budget increased 20%. That is the biggest mistake we can make as a community.
Thanks, great talk. Can you talk a little bit about, so these are all big and complicated problems.
Yeah.
How university interests down the line, how publisher interests frequently down the line. Can you talk a little bit about IGDA as an organization, and what is it? What are the initiatives that you guys do that to change?
Yeah,
which is super hard.
So now that we've talked about all these big scary things going on, all right, what do we do? What specifically do we do when we leave this room? So when I stepped in as the executive director of the IGDA about a year ago, the first thing we did is said, you know what, our mission is not appropriate anymore. The IGDA can't just be an advocacy group, because we have real and significant challenges facing our community. And we reshaped our mission, and you can read the formal mission out at our booth, to help game developers have sustainable and fulfilling careers. And those are really important. Sustainable, and guess what? Expecting to crunch for 10 years of your life is not sustainable. And fulfilling. because I want every single person in this room to make games for 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40 or 50 years, and to feel like you are financially secure, you are happy, you are healthy, and you led a meaningful and valuable life. And I'm worried that that's not what we're set up to do right now. So we have this big lofty vision. How does that translate into specifics? We've changed how we support those 150 chapters and SIGs around the world. We now give them direct financial support, which we've never done before. And we allow them to reinvest that back into their local community, whether it's just buying beer for their meetups or sending people to conferences or bringing speakers in, helping to boost their network. We have a sister chapter program. So one of the things that we believe is because we are a global community, we have a responsibility to help people grow their global network. If you are based in Prague, we want to introduce you to someone in Philadelphia. And we want you to discover your shared community and your shared goals and your shared opportunities. You might have seen that we just announced a virtual mentor cafe to specifically help developers who've been laid off in the last 2 months find their next opportunity. Because if you are in San Francisco and you want to move someplace else, maybe you're interested in opportunities with wargaming in Prague or in Minsk, you're probably not going to have the network that's going to connect you there. Guess what? We do. And we can leverage that network, those 10,000 developers to help you out specifically. We're bringing back more educational programs. So we just hosted the IGDA Leadership Summit in Austin, Texas. Our next one in 2019 will be in Helsinki. And we're really making an effort to grow that global community again. And we brought back webinars too. And a lot of the webinars are not necessarily going to focus on the craft of game development, but rather some of the bigger issues. Like we had a webinar, our first webinar was on GDPR and the privacy requirements and how that impacts game developers. Our next one is going to be on balancing mental health for indie game developers. We'll be talking about things like how to give a good one-on-one. So a lot of the skills that we need to succeed as leaders and as managers and as employees that a lot of our companies aren't necessarily training us on. And those are our big initiatives when we think about what the community needs over the next 12 to 18 months. It's really about giving game developers access to the community, the global community that they need, as well as the specific resources and information to help accelerate their career growth and mitigate their career downturn. Because just like the games industry being cyclical, our careers are cyclical too. You can sign up outside. Any other questions? Thank you very much, everybody.